A millionaire cattleman stands at the back of a frontier store and hears three women laugh at a barefoot girl in November. Perhaps if her mother spent less on airs and more on leather, the child would not be tracking mud across a clean floor. It is a kindness, really. Bare feet toughen a person. She will thank you one day. The girl says nothing. She pulls one foot behind the other and stares at a shelf of boots she will never own. The cattleman does not raise his voice. He does not correct anyone. He walks out, rides 11 miles, and comes back 4 days later holding a piece of paper that changes who owns the building those women are standing in. And the first order he gives, standing in a store he now owns outright, is about the price of a pair of children's boots. Nobody in Cold Spring, Wyoming territory laughed for a very long time after that. Sumsker to Brave West, and tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from. I read every single one, and I love seeing how far these old prairie stories travel. Winter came early to Cold Spring in 1884. The first hard freeze arrived on the 8th of November, 3 weeks before anyone had planned for it, and it caught half the valley with their root cellars still open and their stock still out on summer grass. The wind came down off the Laramie Range with nothing to slow it. It crossed 40 miles of short grass and hit the town broadside, and it carried a fine grit of frozen dust that got into everything. It got into the coffee. It got into the flour barrels. It got under the doors of the good houses on 3rd Street, and it went straight through the walls of the soddies out past the creek, where the walls were dirt and the roof was dirt, and the only thing between a family and the sky was 2 feet of sod cut in strips and stacked like brick. Ruth Coyle lived in one of those soddies. She was 34 years old. She had been a widow for 2 years and 4 months. Her husband Daniel had died in March of 1882 under a wagon on the Chugwater Road. It was not a dramatic death. A brake shoe wore through, the load shifted on a grade, and a man who had survived 4 years of soldiering and 11 years of freighting was killed by a bolt that cost 11 cents. That was how the West killed people most of the time. Not with gunfights, with bolts and brake shoes and weather. Daniel left Ruth 2 things. He left her 160 acres of proved-up homestead ground with a patent signed by the General Land Office. And he left her a daughter named Sari. Sari Coyle was 11 years old that November. She was small for 11. She had her father's dark hair, which her mother cut straight across at the shoulder with sewing shears because there was no money for anything better, and she had her mother's stubborn chin. She could read. Ruth had taught her out of a Bible and a freight almanac and 1 water-stained copy of a McGuffey reader, and Sari read anything that had words on it. The labels on tin cans, the printing on flour sacks, the notices nailed up outside the land office. She also had no shoes. This is the part people get wrong when they hear a story like this. They picture a girl who chose to go barefoot, a country child running wild in summer. That was not it. Sari had owned a pair of boots. They were second-hand when she got them. They had been re-soled twice with harness leather. In September, the left one split clean through the vamp where the upper meets the sole. Ruth sewed it. It split again. She sewed it again with wax thread and a saddler's awl, and the leather itself had gone to powder around the stitching, and there was nothing left to sew to. In October, Ruth cut both boots down for patch leather, because leather was worth more as patches than as a boot that could not be worn. So Sari went barefoot into November. In the soddy, she wore 2 pairs of her father's wool socks with rawhide laced over them. Outside, on the frozen ground, she went bare, because rawhide on ice is a way to break a leg and wool socks in mud are a way to lose your only wool socks. Ruth had a plan. Ruth always had a plan. She had $41 coming to her in December, from a season of taking in laundry and mending for the section crew, laying track on the Cheyenne and Northern Spur. Out of that $41, $1.30 was already spoken for. That was the price of a pair of children's grain leather laced shoes out of the Montgomery Ward catalog in Chicago, sizes 11 to 2, delivered by mail to the Cold Spring post office, $1.30. That was the whole distance between her daughter and the winter. If you have never lived close to the edge of things, that number will not mean much to you. Let me put it in the shape it had in 1884. A cowhand on a Wyoming outfit was paid $30 a month and found. A laundress was paid by the piece and did well to clear 12. A hundredweight of flour cost around $3. $1.30 was a day and a half of hard labor, and it was also, at that exact moment, more money than Ruth Coyle had in the world. Because everything she earned went first to the one place in Cold Spring that everybody in the valley owed money to. The Pruitt Mercantile. Stay with me here, because in a few minutes I am going to show you what was actually written inside that store's ledger book, and it is the reason this entire story happened. If you are enjoying this so far, tap that like button. One tap. It genuinely helps these stories find the people who need them. Marcus Pruitt came to Cold Spring in 1877 with a wagon of goods and a very good understanding of how a frontier town actually works. He understood that in a place with no bank, no cash crop, and one harvest a year, the man who owns the store is not really a merchant. He is the credit system. He is the bank, the pawnbroker, and the mortgage holder all at once, and he does all of it with one leather-bound book. They called it the book account. Nearly every family in the valley had a page in it. You came in, you took your flour and your coffee and your kerosene and your nails, and Pruitt wrote it down in your column, and you paid in the fall when your crop or your calves came in. If you could not pay in the fall, it carried, and when it carried, it grew. That was the whole machine. Nothing about it was illegal. Most of it was not even unusual. Every crossroads store from Texas to Dakota ran a book account, and plenty of them ran it honestly. What made the Pruitt Mercantile different was two small habits Marcus Pruitt had, and neither one of them was written anywhere a customer could see. The first habit was that Pruitt kept two prices. There was a cash price, chalked on a slate by the door, and there was a book price, which was what actually went into the ledger when you charged something. The book price ran higher, not wildly higher, 10 cents on the dollar, 12, sometimes 15, enough to be real, and not enough to argue about. And since almost nobody in that valley ever paid cash, almost nobody ever saw the two numbers side by side. The second habit was the carrying charge. When a balance rolled from one season into the next, Pruitt added what he wrote in the margin as "SI," which he told anyone who asked stood for carrying, and which he calculated in a way he never explained to a single customer in 7 years. Ruth Coyle's page had been rolling since her husband died. She had gone into it honestly. In the spring of 1882 she buried Daniel, and she charged a coffin, a burial, and $11 of seed to get a crop into the ground with no man to help her put it there. $38 and change. She had paid it down every single season since. She had paid down $212 in 2.5 years, out of laundry and mending and eggs and one sold heifer. And on the 8th of November 1884, Ruth Coyle's page in that ledger showed a balance of $96.40. She had paid $212 against a $38 debt, and she owed more than when she started. She knew the number was wrong. She had no way in the world to prove it. She had asked once, in the spring, and Marcus Pruitt had turned the book around, put his finger on a column of figures written in his own hand, and said, "It's all right there, Mrs. Coyle, plain as day," and it was right there. It was in ink. It was in a bound book with a lock on the drawer it lived in. And there was not one other written record of a single transaction in that entire valley, because Pruitt did not give receipts. That is the thing to hold on to. Not the cruelty that is coming, the arithmetic. The cruelty is what people remember about this story. The arithmetic is what made the cruelty possible. On the morning of the 18th of November, Ruth hitched her one horse to a sledge, because the ground was too hard for wheels and too bare for a proper sleigh, and she and Sari went into Cold Spring to deliver 11 pounds of finished mending to the section crew's foreman and to collect against it. The temperature at first light was 11 degrees above zero. Sari rode with her feet wrapped in a grain sack and her mother's coat across her knees. When they got to town, she got down onto the frozen road barefoot, because the sack was needed for the mending. They collected $2.60 from the foreman. It was the first cash Ruth had held since August. And then Ruth Coyle made the decision this entire story turns on. She had $2.60 in her hand. She owed $96.40 at the Pruitt Mercantile. And she walked her daughter through that door anyway, because $1.30 of that money was going to buy a pair of boots off the catalog counter, and there was not one power on this earth that was going to stop her. The Pruitt Mercantile took up the whole south corner of Front Street. It was frame-built with a false front, and inside it was warm, which by itself made it the most popular room in Cold Spring in the winter. There was a stove in the middle with a rail around it. There was a long counter down the right side. glass-topped at the near end where the small valuable things lived. Behind the counter was the wall of drawers and the shelves that went to the ceiling. Coffee, sugar, dried apples, kerosene, bolts of calico and linsey, and one bolt of good wool that had sat there 2 years because nobody in the valley could afford it. Along the back wall, past the harness pegs and the horse collars, there was the catalog counter. That was where you ordered the things Cold Spring did not stock. A copy of Montgomery Ward's catalog sat chained to it, because it was the single most valuable book in town, and it walked off if you did not chain it. Sari Coyle went to that counter the way other children go to a candy jar. She had the page memorized. She did not have to look it up. Children's grain leather laced shoes, sizes 11 to 2, $1.30. There was a small engraving beside the entry, showing a shoe with 3 eyelets and a stitched welt. She had been looking at that engraving for 2 months. Standing near the stove that morning were 3 women. Adelia Pruitt, who was Marcus Pruitt's wife, and who was in the store nearly every day. Verna Doss, whose husband ran the livery, and a younger woman named Cordelia Hatch, who had come out from Ohio in the spring and was still working out where she fit. Adelia Pruitt was 46. She wore a wool dolman with a fur collar, and she was, by every account anyone ever gave of her, not a stupid woman. That matters, she was not a cartoon. She knew precisely what every family in that valley owed her husband, because she helped him post the book on Sunday evenings, and she had built her whole standing in Cold Spring on being the wife of the man who held the paper on everyone. She watched Ruth Coyle come through the door with $2.60. She watched the barefoot child go straight to the catalog counter, and she said, loud enough for the whole room, "Mrs. Coyle, how good of you to come in. Marcus was only just saying he had not seen your page move since August." Ruth kept walking. "I've payment on account, Mrs. Pruitt." "Well, that is a relief." Adelia turned back toward the other 2 women, and she did not lower her voice. She raised it very slightly, the way people do when the second half of a sentence is meant for a different audience than the first. "Though I confess I would have put the money to shoes before I put it to sugar." Verna Doss laughed. It was not a loud laugh. That is worth saying, because people who tell this story afterward always make it a roar, and it was not. It was a short, pleased, private little sound, and Cordelia Hatch, who was new and wanted to belong, made the same sound half a second later. Those 2 small noises did more damage in that room than a gunshot would have. Sari Coyle heard it from the back wall. She did what she always did. She pulled her left foot behind her right ankle, and she stood very still, and she looked hard at the catalog page, so that she did not have to look at anything else. Ruth put her mending money on the counter. $2.60 against the account, Mr. Pruitt. And $1.30 of it is not going against the account. $1.30 is an order off the catalog. Marcus Pruitt was a narrow man of 50 with ink on the side of his right hand. He looked at the coins. He looked at the ledger, which was open because it was always open. "Mrs. Coyle," he said, "I can't rightly take an order from an account that's $96 in arrears. You understand my position. I'm paying cash for it. Cash that's owed to me." He said it kindly. That was the worst part. Marcus Pruitt almost never said anything unkindly. "Anything you hand me across this counter goes to the balance first. That's how the book works. It's how it's always worked. And you know I'd be doing wrong by every other family in that book if I made an exception." And Adelia Pruitt, warming her hands at the stove rail, said the sentence that got repeated in every kitchen in that valley for the next 20 years. Perhaps if her mother spent less on airs and more on leather, the child would not be tracking mud across a clean floor. Verna Doss laughed again. "It is a kindness, really," Adelia went on, and now she was looking directly at Sari, who had turned around. "Bare feet toughen a person. My own father grew up without a shoe to his name, and he was the better for it. She will thank you one day, Mrs. Coyle. Truly." The store was not silent. That is another thing people get wrong. There were 9 or 10 people in it, and the stove was ticking, and somebody's dog was under the bench by the door, and life just went on around it, which is how public cruelty actually works. It does not stop a room. It happens inside a room that keeps going. Ruth Coyle stood at that counter with her hands flat on the glass. Here is what she was doing in that second. And it is the only heroic thing in this whole chapter. She was counting. She was counting the number of families in Cold Spring who took in laundry, which was 1. She was counting the number of stores in Cold Spring, which was 1. She was counting the number of winters her daughter had left in that soddy if the Pruitts decided to call the account, which was 0. And so Ruth Coyle said, "Yes, ma'am." She said it evenly. She did not look up. She took her daughter's hand. She left $2.60 on the glass counter of the Pruitt mercantile, and she walked out into 11-degree weather with a barefoot child and nothing to show for the morning but a number in another man's book that had gone down by $2.60 and would grow back by more than that before spring. The bell over the door rang when it closed behind them, and a man who had been standing at the harness wall the entire time, 40 feet back in the dim part of the store with a horse collar in his hands, put the collar down on its peg and did not say one word to anybody. His name was Thomas Rook. If you had asked anyone in Cold Spring that morning who he was, most of them would have guessed a drover looking for winter work. He was 52. He wore a canvas coat that had been rained on for 6 years and a hat that had lost its shape somewhere around 1879. His hands were a working man's hands. He had come in for a horse collar and a keg of nails, and he had been quiet at the back of the store for a quarter of an hour, and not one person in that room had looked at him twice. Thomas Rook ran cattle on 81,000 acres of deeded and leased ground between the Sybil and the Laramie. He held a controlling interest in a Cheyenne bank, 2 freight contracts, and a slaughter and packing concern in Omaha he had bought in a bad year and turned around in a good one. In the winter of 1884, he was one of the 4 or 5 wealthiest men in Wyoming Territory, and he dressed like a man who mended his own fence, because he did mend his own fence, and because he had learned a long time ago that the fastest way to find out what a town was really like was to walk into it looking like nobody at all. He bought his horse collar. He paid cash. Marcus Pruitt wrote nothing down. Then Thomas Rook went out into the cold and stood on the boardwalk for a minute, watching a woman lift a barefoot child onto a sledge and tuck a grain sack around her feet. And he did a thing that most people in this story never bothered to do. He followed them home, not close. He rode out the Chugwater Road behind the sledge at a quarter mile, and he stopped on a rise a half-mile short of the Coyle place. And he sat on his horse in 11-degree weather and looked at it for a long time. He saw a soddy with a stovepipe and a sod roof that had been patched with a section of freight canvas. He saw a pole corral holding 1 horse. He saw 11 acres of winter wheat put in by hand, in rows so straight they could only have been laid by somebody walking a line with a string, because a woman without a team plants in string lines or she does not plant at all. He saw a stack of buffalo chips and split cottonwood, and he looked at the size of that stack and did the arithmetic that any man who has wintered stock does automatically. And the arithmetic said that stacks was 6 weeks of fuel and there were 19 weeks of winter left. And he saw a girl get down off a sledge, cross 50 feet of frozen ground barefoot, and go inside. Thomas Rook turned his horse around and rode 11 miles to the Cheyenne and northern siding at Chugwater, where there was a telegraph key, and at 4:20 in the afternoon on the 18th of November 1884, he sent 3 wires. The first went to his own bank in Cheyenne. The second went to a lawyer named Hollis Pate, who had done his contract work for 9 years. The third went to the county seat, to a clerk in the office of the Register of Deeds, and it asked one question. It asked who held the ground and the improvements under the building on the south corner of Front Street in Cold Spring, and it asked what paper stood against them. He got the answer on the 20th. And the answer was the thing that turned this from a sad story into the story that people in that valley still told 50 years later. Here is what Thomas Rook learned in 2 days, sitting in a hotel room in Chugwater with a stack of wires and a lawyer riding up from Cheyenne to meet him. Marcus Pruitt did not own the Pruitt mercantile. Not the way people in Cold Spring assumed he did. The building was his. The goods were his. But the ground under it was a town lot leased out of the original Cold Spring townsite plat, and the building itself carried a chattel mortgage of $4,200, taken in 1881 and held by a commission and supply house in Denver that had advanced Pruitt his stock on credit through 3 bad seasons. Pruitt had been paying it down at $110 a quarter. He had 11 quarters left. That was the first thing. The second thing was worse, and it came in a wire from the Register of Deeds at 4 in the afternoon on the 20th of November. Since the spring of 1882, 9 patented homesteads in the Cold Spring Valley had changed hands, Every single one of them had gone from a settler's name to the name of Marcus Pruitt, or to a Cheyenne land agency that listed Marcus Pruitt as a party. Every single one of them had transferred by way of a judgment on a store account, 9 families, 9 patents. All of it done legally, in daylight, 1 book page at a time. And when Hollis Pate laid the 9 descriptions out on the hotel bed and matched them against a survey map, they were not scattered. They were not random farms that happened to fail. They ran in an unbroken line along the east bank of Cold Spring Creek, from the county road north to the ford, and they were the only ground in that valley with year-round running water and a grade a locomotive could climb. The Cheyenne and Northern was building north. Everyone knew that. What almost nobody in Cold Spring had thought about was that a railroad needs water more than it needs anything else, because a locomotive in 1884 drank its own weight, and then some, and a railroad will pay whatever it has to pay for a water stop on a grade. Marcus Pruitt had not been running a store. He had been running a machine that turned flour and kerosene into creek frontage, and there was one gap in his line. One patent he had not gotten yet. It sat directly on the ford, it had 160 acres of it, and the name on the patent was Daniel Coyle, deceased, with the widow's dower and the balance in his estate, $96.40. That was the whole distance between Marcus Pruitt and the last piece he needed. Thomas Rook read that wire twice. Then he folded it, put it in his coat, and said one sentence to his lawyer that Hollis Pate repeated for the rest of his life. Buy the paper on that store. Now, while 2 men in a hotel room were doing arithmetic on a survey map, I want you to know what was happening 11 miles away. Because this is the part of the story that never makes it into the version people tell in saloons. The cold snapped harder on the 19th. The thermometer nailed outside the Cold Spring post office read 4 degrees below zero at 7 in the morning, and did not climb above 11 all day. Ruth Coyle got up at 4:30, the way she got up every day, and she broke the ice on the water bucket with the flat of an axe. Sary's feet had cracked open. If you have never seen it, chapped skin on a child's heel in real cold does not look like a scrape. It opens in straight lines, deep, across the ball and the heel, and it bleeds a little, and it closes over at night, and it opens again the second she walks. Ruth had been treating it since the first week of November with mutton tallow and a scrap of flannel, and she had run out of flannel, and now she was cutting strips off the hem of her own underskirt. That morning Ruth Coyle sat on the edge of a rope bed in a sod house with her daughter's foot in her lap, and she greased the cracks, and she wrapped them. And Sary did what Sary always did, which was hold still and not make a sound. It doesn't hurt, Sary said. It does, not much. Ruth tied off the last strip. You are the worst liar in this territory, she said, and I have never once been prouder of anybody. They had this argument, or a version of it, every morning that winter. That was the whole shape of the Coyle household. A woman who would not say the thing was hopeless, and a girl who would not say the thing hurt, and neither of them fooling the other for a single second. At 7:30, Sary went out to the corral to break the ice on the stock trough. She went out barefoot with the wrappings on, because there was nothing else to go out in, and she came back with her feet gray and her lips gray, and she stood by the stove and said, quite calmly, "Ma, I think I'd like to sit down." That was the 19th of November. By the 20th, Ruth had decided she had one thing left to sell. It was in a wooden box under the head of the bed, and it was a Waltham pocket watch, key-wound, 17 jewel, in a plain silver case with the initials DJC scratched inside the back. Daniel had carried it 11 years. It was the only object in that soddy worth more than $2, and Ruth had told herself every hard month for 2.5 years that she would sell everything else first. She had now sold everything else. On the morning of the 21st, she walked the 11 miles into Cold Spring in weather that never got above 9 degrees, and she carried that watch into the Pruitt mercantile and put it on the glass counter, and she said, "I want to trade against my page, and I want boots off the catalog, and I want them ordered today." Marcus Pruitt picked up the watch. He opened the case, he turned it in the light. "It's a good movement," he said. "Case is thin, silver's soft. You've got wear on the bow. It's a 17 jewel Waltham. It is." He set it down. "I'll allow you $6. Ruth Coyle did not move for a long moment. $6. Against 96.40, on a watch that a jeweler in Cheyenne would have given 18 for without looking twice. "And the boots," she said. $6 against the balance, Mrs. Coyle. Nothing off the catalog until the page is clear. He was already writing. You've got a great deal of pride for a woman in your position, and I say that with respect. But pride's not legal tender. Here is what Ruth Coyle did. She reached across that counter and she picked her dead husband's watch back up, and she put it in her coat pocket. Then I'll keep it, she said. Suit yourself. I will. She turned at the door. There were 5 people in the store, and she said it to all of them, in a voice that was perfectly level. You'll get that 160 acres over my body, Mr. Pruitt. Not 1 hour before, she had no idea what she had just said. That is the thing. She said it out of pure exhausted spite, standing in a warm store with frozen feet, and she had not the faintest notion that she had just named the exact thing the man behind the counter had been working toward for 2.5 years. Marcus Pruitt's pen stopped. It stopped for about a second and a half, and then it started again, and he said, "Mind the step, it's iced." But Adelia Pruitt was standing at the stove rail, and Adelia Pruitt had helped post that book every Sunday evening for 7 years, and Adelia Pruitt looked at the door for a long moment after it closed. Then she said quietly to her husband, "How much longer on the Coyle place?" And Marcus Pruitt said, "Spring. If this story is holding you, do me one small favor and hit subscribe before we go on. There are 4 more turns in this thing, and the last one is the one people remember. Subscribing costs you nothing, and it keeps these stories coming." Thomas Rook and Hollis Pate came into Cold Spring on the afternoon of the 24th of November on the mail sledge, which is worth noticing, because a man worth what Rook was worth could have come in any way he liked, and he chose the way that got him in without anyone looking up. They did not go to the store. They went to the post office, and then to the little frame building on 2nd Street where a man named Elbert Sook kept the county's outlying records and sold fire insurance on the side. And they were in that building for 3 hours and 40 minutes. Then they went to the Cold Spring Hotel, and Hollis Pate sent a wire to Denver, and at 9 o'clock the next morning a wire came back. The commission house in Denver had sold the chattel mortgage on the Pruitt Mercantile, $4,200 face, 11 quarters remaining, plus a $200 consideration for the immediate transfer, to a purchaser of record named T. Rook of Laramie County, Wyoming Territory. Thomas Rook now held the paper on the building, the fixtures, and the entire stock of goods in the Pruitt Mercantile. He did not use it. Not that day. That is the part I want you to sit with for a second, because it is the thing that separates this story from 100 others like it. Thomas Rook had, on the morning of the 25th of November, the power to walk into that store and put Marcus Pruitt on the street inside of a week. He had every reason to want to. He had stood 40 feet away and heard a woman laugh at a barefoot child, and he had been carrying that sound around in his chest for 7 days. He did not do it, because Hollis Pate, who was a careful man, had said something to him in the hotel room in Chugwater that stuck. "You can ruin him tomorrow," Pate had said. "But if you ruin him tomorrow, the 9 families whose ground he holds stay ruined, and everybody in that valley learns that the way you fix a crooked store is to have 81,000 acres, which none of them have." So Thomas Rook waited 8 more days, and in those 8 days, Hollis Pate did the least dramatic and most devastating work in this entire story. He went and found receipts, not from Pruitt. Pruitt gave no receipts, that was the whole architecture. Pate went the other direction. He went to the wholesalers. Every barrel of flour, every case of coal oil, every keg of nails that came into Cold Spring came in on the Cheyenne and Northern, and freight comes with a bill of lading, and a bill of lading has a weight, and an origin, and a consignee, and the houses that shipped that freight, in Cheyenne and in Omaha and in Denver, kept invoices, because they were selling wholesale and wholesale men keep paper. In 8 days Hollis Pate assembled, by wire and by mail, and by one hard ride to Cheyenne, the landed wholesale cost of every principal item that had crossed the counter of the Pruitt Mercantile in the previous 30 months. He did not need Pruitt's book. He could now build the honest version of it from the outside. On the 2nd of December, in a hotel room in Cold Spring with the wind rattling the sash, Hollis Pate finished the last column and turned the sheet around so Thomas Rook could read it. Coffee landed at 19 cents the pound, slated on the cash board at 28. Entered in the book at 34. Coal oil landed at 11 cents the gallon. Cash board 18. Book 22. Grain leather children's shoes, catalog at $1.30 delivered. Entered on the one occasion Pruitt had ever sold a pair on account at $2.05. And then the carrying charge, Pruitt had never once written a rate. He wrote C and a figure, and the figure was different every time. And no customer had ever been able to work backward from it, because you cannot work backward from a single number. But you can work backward from 30 months of them. Hollis Pate had taken every psi entry on 11 different pages of that ledger, and he had solved for the rate, and the rate was 3% a month, compounded monthly on the running balance, including on the previous month's carrying charge. 3% a month, compounded, comes out to a shade over 42.5% a year. The territorial statute in Wyoming in 1884 permitted 12% by written agreement. Anything above it, on a debt with no signed instrument, was not a contract. It was usury, and a court could and would strike the excess. Thomas Rook looked at that number for a while. Then he asked the only question he asked all night. Do the coil page. Hollis Pate had already done the coil page. He turned over the last sheet. Ruth Coil's true balance, computed at honest landed prices with a lawful 12%, against $212 in verified payments, was not $96.40. Ruth Coil had overpaid the Pruitt mercantile by $174.18. She did not owe the store anything. The store owed her more money than she had seen in one place in her entire life. The 4th of December 1884 was a Thursday, and Thursday was the day the Cold Spring Valley came to town. It was not a market day, and it was not a holiday. It was simply the day the mail sledge came up from Chugwater, and in a place where the mail came twice a week, the mail was the reason a man hitched a team in December. By 10 in the morning, there were 19 wagons and sledges along Front Street, and something close to 60 people in and around the Pruitt mercantile, because the store was the only warm room, and the stove was the only reason to stand still. Ruth Coil was there. She had not wanted to be. She had come because the section foreman had left word that her December money was ready, and $41 was $41. And she had walked in from the soddy with Sari, because she would not leave a child alone in that cold with a stove that needed feeding every hour. Sari's feet were wrapped. Everyone could see the wrappings. Adelia Pruitt was at the stove rail with Verna Doss. Marcus Pruitt was behind the counter with the ledger open in front of him, because it was always open, and because Thursday was the day he posted. At 10:10 the door opened, and Thomas Rook came in, and behind him came Hollis Pate carrying a leather case, and behind Pate came Elbert Sook, who sold fire insurance and kept the county's outlying records, and who had not been able to sleep properly for 11 days. Marcus Pruitt looked up and did not recognize the first man at all. "Help you? You sold me a horse collar 3 weeks ago," Rook said. $2.40. Cash, that's so, it was. Rook took his hat off, which in that country was a thing a man did in a house and not in a store, and it made about half the room turn around. "My name is Thomas Rook. I run cattle over on the Cybill. I'd like to speak to the room a minute, and then I'd like to speak to you, and I'd rather do it in that order." Pruitt's face did something complicated. He had heard the name. Every man in Wyoming who moved a cow had heard the name. "This is a place of business, Mr. Rook." "It is," Rook agreed. "It's mine." He said it flatly, without any pleasure in it at all, and Hollis Pate opened the leather case and laid the assignment of mortgage on the glass counter, face up, so a man could read it from either side. $4,200, 11 quarters, building, fixtures, and stock. Purchaser of record T. Rook, Laramie County. Nobody in the room said anything for about 4 seconds. Then Marcus Pruitt said, "And I want you to hear how reasonable he sounded. You've bought paper. You haven't bought a store. I'm not in default and I don't intend to be." "No, sir, you're not in default." Rook put his hat on the counter. "That's why I'm going to buy the rest of it from you, at a fair figure this morning in front of these people. And whether you take the figure or not, everything I'm about to say gets said." He turned around, 60 people, a stove, a wall of drawers, a little girl at the back with her feet wrapped in underskirt flannel. 3 weeks ago, Thomas Rook said, I stood at that harness wall and watched a woman come in here with $2.60 she'd earned mending other people's clothes, and try to buy her child a pair of shoes off the catalog, and get told no. And then I listened to 3 women laugh about the child's bare feet, and I want to be honest with you all, because I've been carrying it since. I didn't say anything, I stood there, and I let it happen, and I walked out. So I'm not up here as a better man than anybody in this room. I'm up here as a man who went home and did some arithmetic." He nodded at Hollis Pate, and Hollis Pate started reading numbers. That was the whole reckoning. There was no gunplay in it. No threats. A lawyer in a wet overcoat stood in a general store in December and read a list of wholesale invoice prices out loud for 11 minutes, and it did more damage to Marcus Pruitt than any weapon on that street could have done. Coffee landed 19 cents. Cashboard 28, book 34, coal oil landed 11, cashboard 18, book 22, salt, nails, calico, lard, coffee again because there were 3 grades and all 3 carried the same spread. And here is where the room turned, and it did not turn at the prices. Frontier storekeepers marked up hard and everybody knew it. The room turned when Hollis Pate got to the letters C and Y. "Mr. Pruitt," he said, "would you tell these people what rate you charge on a carried balance?" "It varies with the season." "It does not vary at all, sir. It is 3% a month, compounded on the month, applied to the running balance including the prior month's charge. And it has been 3% a month since April of 1881. That is 42.5% a year. The statute of this territory permits 12, in writing. You have nothing in writing from anybody in this room." There was a sound in that store then. It was not a shout. It was about 60 people all shifting their weight at the same time, because every single one of them had a page. Emil Tarrant, who ran sheep up the West Fork, said, out loud, to nobody, 4 years. And a man named Peel, who hauled freight, said, "I paid you $800. And Hollis Pate said, "Mr. Peel, I have your figure. If you would come by the hotel this afternoon, he has everybody's figure," Rook said. He built it out of the freight bills because Mr. Pruitt never gave a receipt to a living soul, and that turned out to be the single worst decision he ever made. A man who keeps no receipts also keeps no defense. Marcus Pruitt put both hands flat on the ledger. "You can't prove a word of it without that book," he said, "and that book is my property." "It is," Rook agreed, "and the 9 deeds at the county seat are public." That was the moment, not the interest, not the coffee. The deeds, because Hollis Pate laid out the survey map on the glass counter next to the assignment of mortgage. And there were 9 parcels shaded on it in pencil, and they ran in an unbroken chain up the east bank of Cold Spring Creek from the county road to the ford. And every family in that room knew every one of those names. And they knew what had happened to every one of those families, and until that instant not one of them had ever thought to draw the failures on a map. 9 families. 9 judgments on a store account. 1 line of creek frontage. "The Cheyenne and Northern is grading north out of Chugwater this spring," Thomas Rook said. "A locomotive on that grade needs water. There is 1 place on this creek to put a tank, and it is the ford, and there is 1 patent standing between Mr. Pruitt and every acre of that bank." He did not point at Ruth Coyle. He was careful about that. He kept his eyes on the map. $96.40, he said. That's the price he had on it. Ruth Coyle was standing near the door with her hand on her daughter's shoulder, and she had gone absolutely white, and she was not white from shame. She was white because she had said it herself 11 days before, standing in that exact spot, in temper, with no idea on this earth that she was right. "You'll get that 160 acres over my body, Mr. Pruitt." She had told the truth by accident and she had not known it for 11 days. Hollis Pate turned over the last sheet. "Mrs. Coyle," he said, "your page shows a balance of $96.40. Computed on landed cost and lawful interest. Against payments this office has verified from Mr. Pruitt's own freight and deposit record. Your true position is a credit of $174.18. He set the sheet down. "You do not owe this store anything, ma'am. This store owes you." Ruth Coyle did not cry. She had a rule about that in public, and she kept it. What she did was reach up and take hold of the doorframe and stand there holding it, and Verna Doss, who had laughed on the 18th of November, took 2 steps toward her, and then did not know what to do with herself, and stopped in the middle of the floor. Marcus Pruitt sold the Pruitt Mercantile that morning. He sold it for $1,100 over the mortgage, which was less than it was worth and more than he was going to get from anybody else by the following Thursday, and he signed it on the same glass counter he had refused a pair of children's shoes across. Hollis Pate handled the paper. Elbert Sook witnessed it. It took 40 minutes, and then Thomas Rook, who now owned every board and every barrel in the building, gave his first order as the proprietor. He did not give it to Pruitt. He gave it to a 19-year-old clerk named Wilkie Bragg, who had swept that floor for 2 years and who was standing by the drawers not knowing whether he still had a job. "Son, get the catalog off the chain." Bragg got it. "Fine children's grain leather, laced, sizes 11 to 2, $1.30, sir." Bragg did not have to look it up either. He had watched a girl read that page for 2 months. "From this morning, this store sells shoes to a child at landed cost," Rook said. "No markup, not 1 cent. Freight is on the house. Posted on the slate by the door in a hand big enough to read from the street. And when I come back in March, I want to see it still there." Then he turned around and looked at the back of the room, and for the first and only time that morning his voice was not steady. "And the first pair goes on the account of a man named Daniel Coyle. Here is the part nobody plans for. There were no shoes. The catalog counter was an order counter. A pair of shoes from Chicago was 6 days on the mail, minimum, and it was December. And a child with cracked feet cannot wait 6 days in 4-degree weather, because the arithmetic of frostbite does not care about the mail schedule." And Thomas Rook, who had just spent $4,400 in one morning, stood in the middle of a general store he owned and could not put a shoe on a child's foot. It was Adelia Pruitt who moved. I have thought about this for a long time, and I am not going to tell you it was courage, because I do not know that it was. Her husband had just been ruined in front of 60 people. Her standing in that town, which was the only thing she had ever built, was gone before noon. She had maybe 10 seconds in which anything she did would ever matter again, and she used them. She went behind the counter, past her husband, and she pulled the bolt of good wool down off the shelf. The one that had sat there 2 years because nobody in the valley could afford it. Then she went to the case at the near end, where the small valuable things lived, and she took out a card of harness needles, and a hank of waxed thread, and a roll of sheepskin that was meant for saddle lining. She carried all of it to the back of the store, and she set it down on the catalog counter in front of Ruth Coyle, and she said, in front of everybody, with her voice not working properly at all, "You are a better hand with a needle than I have ever been in my life. There is enough there for 2 pair of boots and a coat." "I am sorry, Mrs. Coyle. I am so very sorry." Ruth Coyle looked at the wool for a long moment, then she said, "Sit down, Sari." And she knelt on the floor of the Pruitt mercantile in front of 60 people. And she took the wrappings off her daughter's feet. And she measured them against the sheepskin with her thumb and forefinger, the way she had measured every garment she had made for 11 years, and she said, "We'll want the hearth by 3 o'clock. I can have 1 pair on her by dark." She had them on her by dark. They were not pretty. Sheepskin lined, wool-topped, sewn with waxed thread on a saddler's awl at a kitchen table by lamplight, with soles cut from the skirt of Daniel Coyle's old freighting coat, because that was the heaviest leather in the house. Sari Coyle wore those boots for 2 winters, and would not give them up when better ones came, and she still had them in a trunk in 1931. By spring, the Cold Spring Valley was a different place. Hollis Pate sat in a room at the hotel for 19 days and worked every page in that ledger, 61 accounts. He recomputed all of them at landed cost and 12%, and when he finished, 44 of the 61 families in the Pruitt book owed nothing at all, and 14 of those 44 were owed money. 3 of the 9 deeds were unwound by consent that same winter, because Marcus Pruitt's lawyer read Paydate's figures and told him plainly that a court would strike the interest and void the judgments, and that the alternative to consent was a usury finding in the territorial record with his name on it. The other 6 went to court in Cheyenne in June, and 5 of them came back. The 6th family had already left for Oregon and could not be found, and their quarter section sat empty for 2 years. Which is the kind of ending real life gives you instead of a tidy one. Marcus and Adelia Pruitt left Cold Spring on the 14th of April 1885. They went to Salt Lake, where Marcus took a clerk's position in a wholesale house at $70 a month, which is a living, and which is also the exact sort of job he had come west in 1877 to stop having. Nobody in the valley ever heard from them again. Ruth Coyle kept the bolt of wool. The store stayed open. Thomas Rook put Wilkie Bragg behind the counter at $40 a month with a share of the profit, and he made 2 rules and wrote them both on the slate by the door, where Pruitt had chalked the cash price. 1 price, cash or book. Interest 1% the month written down, signed by both, on a card the customer keeps. Bragg ran that store for 31 years. The Cheyenne and Northern did come north, and it did need water, and in September of 1886 a right-of-way agent rode out to a soddy on the ford with an offer in his coat pocket. Ruth Coyle sold them a 100-foot strip and a tank site and an easement, and not 1 acre more. She was represented by Hollis Pate, who charged her nothing and told her the number to hold out for, and she held out for it for 5 weeks. The railroad paid $2,200. She built a frame house with 4 rooms and a shingle roof on the rise where a man on a horse had once sat, looking at her woodpile in 11-degree weather. She never met him that day and she never knew he had been there. Thomas Rook came through Cold Spring twice a year for the rest of his life, and he never once ate a meal at the Coyle place, and never once was asked to. Because Ruth Coyle had a very clear sense of the difference between a debt and a friendship, and she was not going to let anybody confuse the two. What she did instead was mend his outfit's winter shirts for 31 years and charge him full price for everyone. Sari Coyle finished school in Cheyenne. She came back to the valley in 1893, and she taught in the Cold Spring School for 4 years, and then she did the thing that tells you everything about who she turned out to be. She went to work in the store. She bought it from Wilkie Bragg's widow in 1916, and she ran it until 1934, and every single day of those 18 years there was a slate by the door with one price on it, cash or book, and under it a line in her own handwriting that a great many people in that valley grew up reading without ever knowing where it came from. Children's shoes at cost. Always. She never explained it to anybody. She did not have to. There were still people alive in that town who had been standing by the stove on the 4th of December 1884, and by the time the last of them died, the line had simply become the kind of thing a store in that valley had on its slate. The way a church has a bell. When Sari Coyle died in 1948 at the age of 75, her family found a wooden box under the head of her bed. Inside it was a 17-jewel Waltham pocket watch in a thin silver case with the initials DJC, scratched inside the back, still keeping time, never once sold. And underneath the watch, folded flat, one page torn out of a Montgomery Ward catalog from 1884, worn soft as cloth along the fold, showing a small engraving of a shoe with 3 eyelets and a stitched welt. And that's where we'll leave Ruth and Sari, in a warm house on a rise above the ford, with the wind doing what the wind does out there, and nobody in that valley owing anybody a dollar they did not truly owe. I hope this ride back to 1884 gave you a chance to step out of the everyday for a while. I'd love to know how you were listening today. Maybe with a cup of coffee, sitting out on the porch, or just winding down for a quiet evening. Drop a comment below. I read every single one. And tell me honestly, did you see the railroad water tank coming before Rook laid that map on the counter? Let me know what country you're watching from too. It always amazes me how far these old prairie stories travel. If this one was worth your time, hitting like and subscribing makes a real difference. Thanks for spending this time with me today.